Hello, and welcome to the Apollo Nemesis Reflections. I'm James Pembroke, Director of the Institute, occasional heretic, and your host for Civilization's Post-Performance Review. Here we examine the choreography of modern life, how power performs, how truth disguises itself, and how the stage lights of politics never quite go out. If you enjoy a little wit with your reason, a little irony with your analysis, then you're among friends. So settle in, and if this reflection provokes thought or the odd grim smile, do the civilized thing. Press like, subscribe, and help keep the lamp burning for independent thinkers and mischief-making academics everywhere. Now, on with the reflection. So, picture the scene. Westminster, November. The sky, the colour of accountancy paper, the mood, pure fiscal Calvinism. Inside the Commons, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, rises with the air of someone about to tell the country that its favourite bad habits have been discovered behind the sofa cushions. The script is familiar, a nation living beyond its means, the need to restore stability, the promise that those with the broadest shoulders will bear the greatest burden. It is the kind of language that reassures the bond markets and makes Radio 4 listeners reach instinctively for a pencil. On paper, it is the most progressive of stories: tax rises on the rich, extra money for the NHS, help for families, a moral reset after the years of fiscal cosplay. In practice, it is something rather stranger, a budget that quietly invents a new social category, the expendable professional, and sends the bill firmly to their door. Tonight's reflection is about that category, about what happens when fairness becomes a costume and the state decides that, having exhausted the poor and maxed out the credit card, it will now live off the private sector upper middle. Let us begin with the device at the heart of Reeves's conjuring trick: stealth taxation. For all the noise about mansion levies and windfall taxes, the real work is done not in the big numbers, but in the small ones that fail to move. Income tax thresholds, for example, which, like certain members of the House of Lords, have decided not to retire until the 2030s. It sounds modest. Keep the personal allowance and higher rate thresholds frozen for a few more years. It is anything but modest. In a world of inflation, a frozen threshold behaves like a stealthy escalator. Every cost of living pay rise nudges more of your income into higher bands, without a single headline saying, "We have raised your tax." It is the fiscal equivalent of those hotel minibars where breathing too near the gin sets off the censor. You haven't done anything wrong. You've simply existed expensively. Everyone is caught, of course, but some people are caught harder. The professional couple on 70k and 80k in the southeast, juggling mortgages, school fees, and the privilege of paying £4.50 for a limp Pret salad, discover they have become rich by the simple method of not dying during the freeze. The genius, if we must call it that, is optical. You can stand at the dispatch box and say, hand on heart, I have not raised the basic or higher rate of income tax, which is true in precisely the way that saying, I have not moved the goalposts, is true after you've set the pitch on a slope. The second movement in this concerto for quiet extraction is the now famous £2,000 cap on NI-free salary sacrifice pension contributions coming in 2029, a technical detail so dull it could clear a select committee. And yet underneath, a direct hit on one of the last legal, boring ways in which private sector high earners could build a halfway decent retirement. Until now, many professionals in the 100k, 200k bracket have used salary sacrifice to move a chunky slice of income into their pensions. The deal is simple. You agree to take less salary, your employer pays it into your pension instead. Both of you save national insurance. Sometimes the employer even shares their NI saving with you. Add it up over a decade, and it's the difference between a precarious old age and a dignified one. From 2029, all of that still exists, but only for the first £2,000 a year. After that, the taxman parks himself in your pension like a tenant who never leaves. The budget speech frames this as closing a loophole for the wealthy. And to the median voter, it sounds impeccably reasonable. Why should the rich get clever tricks? Let them pay NI like everyone else. Except, of course, this is where the ghost of fairness begins to howl. Because when we say high earners, we are not including everyone who earns a high salary. We are including only those whose pensions depend on the market. If you are an MP, a cabinet minister, a senior civil servant, an NHS consultant, a judge, or a high-ranking officer in one of the uniformed services, you are, in the polite jargon, a member of a defined benefit scheme. You do not rely on salary sacrifice. You do not worry whether the S&P 500 has decided to have a nervous breakdown. Your pension is not a pot you stare at in an app. It is a promise written in statute and underwritten by taxpayers not yet born. Your retirement depends on time served and a formula. The only sacrifice required is the number of committee meetings you've endured. The £2,000 NI cap does nothing to you. It does not brush your cuff. You may, if you wish, applaud its fairness loudly in the chamber and then return calmly to your taxpayer-backed future. If, however, you are a private sector consultant, engineer, senior manager, SME director, tech lead, or finance professional, earning roughly the same, but in a defined contribution scheme where the only guarantee is that charges will be deducted, then this reform is not fairness, it is a haircut, administered with a lawnmower, 2 people, same salary. One enjoys a guaranteed, inflation-linked, lifetime income backed by the state, untouched by the reform. The other loses a powerful tool for building the only pension they will ever have. This, we are told, is the broadest shoulders bearing more of the burden. The Chancellor does not mention that some of those shoulders are wearing ministerial red boxes, and some are wearing hospital lanyards in the private wing. Behind this lies a quiet truth that almost no one in Westminster will say aloud. Britain is drifting into a 2-tier pension society. Tier 1 is the DB aristocracy, public sector high earners and a few legacy corporate schemes. They live in a time capsule, still governed by the old social democratic promise, work for us loyally and we will look after you when you can no longer work. Tier 2 is the DC precariat, everyone else. Their fate depends on markets, contribution ceilings, government mood, and the hope that no clever Treasury official decides their modest tax advantages have suddenly become a distortion. This budget does not just fail to correct that imbalance, it deepens it, and then rebrands the outcome as justice. Next, let us consider the decorative garnish, the taxes on dividends, savings, and high-value property. Here, the optics are superb. The words themselves sound like the contents of a Guardian comment section. Dividends, BUO, property, boo, savings income, depends how far north you live. Dividend rates nudge up. Tax on savings income rises by a couple of percentage points. Homes over £2 million get a new annual levy. All of this is presented as a long overdue reckoning with unearned wealth. Cue approval from those who dream of oligarchs forced to sell a yacht to fund a hospital wing. In reality, the oligarchs have long since moved their yachts to other harbours. The people who feel this are the slightly awkward creatures no one ever quite knows what to do with, the upper middle, often in the southeast. The doctor and lecturer couple whose house tripled in value simply by not blowing away in a storm. The small business owner who pays themselves largely in dividends because that is how companies work. The ordinary buy-to-let landlord with 2 flats in Slough, who is now apparently part of the asset-owning class enemy. They are not poor, some are very comfortable indeed. But the key point is this: they are not the people who designed the system, and yet they are the ones the system now presents to the country as the villains. It is always safer to rage at the dentist in Guildford than at the shadowy family office in Mayfair. The dentist pays PAYE, the family office pays someone else to worry about it. So we arrive at the budget's central symmetry. The state places a polite but firm hand in the pockets of those visible enough to resent, but not powerful enough to resist. At this point, one might ask, what is this elaborate redistribution for? If the answer were a great national reconstruction, one could at least admire the ambition. If Reeves stood up and said, yes, we are squeezing you and hard, but in 10 years' time you will have a rebuilt NHS, mass transit that does not resemble a social experiment, universities that do not charge your children a mortgage to think, and a state that works like something built this century. Then there would be an argument. Instead, what we are offered is continuity with slightly better bedside manner. More money goes into the NHS, yes, into a structure that has already eaten multiple cash injections without noticeably altering its metabolic rate. Public services get some relief, but not the kind of structural rewiring that would justify calling this a reforming budget. As for the swollen long-term liability of public sector DB pensions, the great iceberg beneath the Treasury's waterline, not a whisper. We tinker with the contributions of the people who have no guarantees and leave the guarantees of those who make the rules entirely untouched. From the vantage point of the Apollo Nemesis Institute, one might say, the performance has changed, the script has not. Let us, for a moment, pull back the curtain and look not at the lines, but at the incentives. Politically, the coalition that must be kept sweet includes public sector workers and their unions, especially in health and education, the core political class of MPs, ministers, senior civil servants, a chunk of older homeowners who can be managed by reassuring noises about property and pensions. Economically, the revenue must come from people who are working, people who are too disorganized to shield their income, people who will not start a general strike. In other words, private sector professionals and the broad working middle. Seen in that light, this budget is almost admirably honest, not in its language, but in its targeting. It asks, who can we take the most from with the least trouble? Answer, the people who already pay most of the tax, who do not have a union, and who are told when they object that they are selfish for not wanting to fund the NHS. Now, before the accusation of heartlessness arrives by registered post, let me be clear, there is nothing ignoble about asking those on higher incomes to support the vulnerable. A civilized society will always do some version of that. The question is not whether redistribution should happen, but how, from whom, and to what end. What we have instead is redistribution that is sector-skewed, structurally regressive, and rhetorically flattering. It flatters the political class by leaving their pensions untouched, flatters public sector elites by preserving their temporal privileges, and flatters the electorate by describing all of this as making the rich pay. There is a phrase for this at the Institute, simulation of fairness, the appearance of justice without its costlier elements. Consider, for instance, what a genuinely fair rebalancing of pension privilege might look like. You would start not from the mechanism, salary sacrifice versus accrual formula, but from the outcome. What lifetime income do different schemes actually deliver per pound of tax relief? You would treat DB and DC schemes within a single framework, measuring the implicit taxpayer guarantee alongside explicit subsidies. A senior civil servant's inflation-linked DB promise would be taxed according to the value of the guarantee it represents, just as a private sector DC pot is taxed according to its visible size. You might decide that there should be a unified ceiling on how much pension wealth can be privileged by the state across all schemes, after which any extra accrual is treated simply as deferred salary. You would be forced to admit in public that politicians and top officials are among the greatest individual beneficiaries of pension tax relief in the land, and that a reform which touches private salary sacrifice but not public DB is not fairness. It is an insider carve-out. Such a conversation, however, would require an appetite that modern politics finds indigestible. The appetite to treat the public sector not as a priestly caste, but as a group of workers whose interests occasionally conflict with those who pay their wages. It is much more comfortable to treat the private sector professional as both source of revenue and object of suspicion. And so we return to our opening scene. Rachel Reeves at the dispatch box, declaring that the days of fantasy are over, that reality has returned. In one sense, she is right. The numbers are what they are. The fiscal headroom is dust. The promises of every government since 2010 have finally hit the buffers of arithmetic. But there is another quieter fantasy that this budget fully embraces. The fantasy that we can build a fair, dynamic society by steadily worsening the deal for the people who actually generate the tax base, while leaving the state's own embedded privileges largely intact. It is the fantasy that you can keep telling ambitious young people, study hard, work hard, take risks, and your reward will be a higher marginal tax rate, a weaker pension, and the privilege of subsidizing those whose pensions cannot be touched. The danger is not that such people become poor. The danger is that they become disengaged, that they adjust their effort to match the respect they are shown. Some will emigrate, some will downshift, some will simply conclude that if the state does not treat them as stakeholders, they will stop behaving like stakeholders. At that point, your tax base doesn't erode dramatically, it erodes imperceptibly. A percentage point off effort here, a relocation there, a business never founded because the after-tax payoff looks anemic. No line in the Red Book says, we have disincentivized the ambitious, but the effect accumulates. And one day the Chancellor stands up and discovers that the broadest shoulders have moved to another gym. So, what should we learn from this budget, beneath the graphs and the slogans? First, that language has become a fiscal instrument. Words like fairness, rich, loophole and broad shoulders are now part of the revenue architecture. The budget depends on people hearing those words and not asking which shoulders, which rich, whose loophole. Second, that Britain's new class line is not simply between rich and poor, but between state-protected insiders and market-exposed outsiders. The former enjoy time, security and defined benefits. The latter enjoy PowerPoint and HMRC letters. Third, that unless we confront this directly with an honest cross-sector reckoning about pensions, thresholds and what we actually want the state to do, we will drift further into a politics of mutual resentment where everyone is convinced they are the one being played. And finally, that budgets are not only about money, they are moral weather reports. They tell you who the state trusts, who it fears, and who it feels safe enough to overcharge. This budget tells us very clearly that the British state trusts itself, fears the bond markets and feels perfectly safe, overcharging the people in the middle who keep everything running and have no lobby of their own. Whether that is sustainable is another question. But for now, the curtain falls, the numbers add up, and the applause comes dutifully from those whose pensions are guaranteed. And that concludes today's reflection, a small parable from the theatre of power where every silence tells a story and every spreadsheet leaves a footprint in history's wet cement. If you found something to ponder, or at least something to raise an eyebrow at, please do the civilized thing, like subscribe and help keep the lamp burning for independent thinkers and mischief-making academics everywhere. I'm James Pembroke, and this has been the Apollo Nemesis Reflections, where irony is still a public service and truth occasionally sneaks past the censors disguised as wit. Until next time, lux ratio retributio.